Hello everyone, you're watching a new video about adult learning and education in Europe, prepared by the Ukrainian Adult Education Association and supported by DV International in Ukraine. My name is Victoria and today I'm honored to talk to Gustaf Fridolin, Swedish journalist, author, teacher, board member of the European Association for Education of Adults, and a former politician who served as a Minister of Education in 2014-2019. Hello, Gustaf. It's a pleasure to meet you today, and thank you for accepting the invitation to join this talk.
Of course, very nice meeting you. Always great to meet colleagues from the adult education scene in Europe.
Thank you. You've got such a versatile background. What's your most prioritized field of work in the present day?
Oh, I'm a teacher, as we say in Sweden, where part of us being adult educators are trained as folk high school teachers, and I am that from Linköping University. So that's what I do. I ended politics in 2019, and then I went back to the folk high school where I previously worked, and I've been working there ever since. Part of my work has been in doing research about the folk high school as well, but I believe that I will never again give up being in the classroom, taking part of education.
Okay. In this podcast, we talk mainly about adult education and its development, discovering how things work in other countries, to borrow some good practices for the Ukrainian context. And I'd like to start by bringing light to the model of adult education in Sweden in general. In brief, it is grounded on 3 pillars. I will try to summarize. If you have any remarks, you can add. The first pillar is folkbілднінг, popular education. It is a collective name for the activities conducted by folk high schools and study associations. It includes long-term programs and for further vocational training and short-term courses such as study circles. The next one is municipal adult education, convox, which includes courses at compulsory school level and at upper secondary level, including vocational tracks and Swedish for immigrants. And the last one is higher vocational education. It is the next level after upper secondary school or convox. Such programs typically last 1 to 3 years and combine classroom-based theory with work-based learning in workplaces. I won't go into details, and I'll add more information for our viewers in the description of this video. Now I'd rather focus on some peculiarities of adult education in Sweden. So, Gustaf, from your point of view, what is special about that?
One of the things that makes it special is the long tradition that adult education and especially folkbildning predates Swedish democracy. It was first founded in the mid-1800s, and quite soon it became tools for the popular movement that wanted to create democracy, and that was both for them wanting to create it in as a system for the society, but also in the small circumstances. So it was often democratic schools or a setting of education in a democratic manner. It taught people to work practically for the democracy, such as if you look at the free churches, they had folk high school and study circles where you learned how to practice your religion in your way and not in the way that used to be the only permitted way when Sweden had a lack of religious diversity, or the labor movement's folk high schools. They taught people to become organizers or better negotiators towards the employers, so they could make deals with the employers on the working conditions. So they create the democracy in the different settings, which lay ground for Sweden actually becoming a democracy in the 1920s. And somehow this tradition is still part of, especially part of the folkbildning, where you have a very democratic way of working with education. Me as a teacher has the possibility to learn as much as the students coming. We also have the formal assignment by the state to make sure that more people get active in both cultural life and in democracy. We have the possibility to have courses that are not only for the participants to understand the world, but actually learning how to change the world. And that fundament of what we're doing is still quite obvious in our adult education scene.
Okay. You mentioned this historical paradigm and this necessity or, I don't know, need to support democracy by studying. Is it possible to summarize like the main purpose of adult learning in Sweden in the present day? What's the biggest aim of adult learning today?
Well, it is very different from different courses and different participants. But if you should summarize it, I would say that adult learning and adult education makes possible for adults to grow in a manner that they decide by themselves and to take power over their life circumstances. In folkbildning, that is combined with having the possibility to make collective action on how to change the society and the world as a whole. But this is the part to grow in a way that you decide yourself. That could be take time off to study something that you're very interested in for your own good, or taking part in a civil society organization, and with folkbildning trying to share your experiences with others, or courses directed at seniors that gets a possibility in a part of life where we know that loneliness can be a big problem, also a big health problem, a possibility to meet with others and find new friends and new interests. Or it could be more formal, to get experiences, knowledge, or even qualifications that makes it possible to study on higher education, or that makes it more better for you to get the kind of work that you would like to work within. Or it could be this collective engagement that actually you work together to make some kind of collective change in accordance with the civil society organization that you work within, and that may be the provider of the Folkhögskola or the study association.
Okay, thank you. You gave great definitions, and actually there are many possible aims. It depends on the needs of people and their current life situation, probably why they come to adult learning, enriching themselves by learning, right? So yeah, it really depends, but there are so many aspects.
Yeah, and they are also interconnected. I work myself, and I've always worked with adults, mostly quite young adults, from 18, 19 to 25, that lack a degree from upper secondary high school. And in the Folkhögskola, we have the possibility to give an equivalent degree. So they come to the Folkhögskola quite often with a feeling that they've been let down by the educational system before. They haven't got the same possibilities to reach this degree from upper secondary high school that many others have. And they are uncertain whether or not they will have the possibility to get it at us. But we work hard, we work together, and many of them actually get a degree that they haven't had the possibility to get in other educational settings. And at the same time, we can see by evaluations that they also get more engaged in the society as a whole and in the democracy. So these goals, in this case, the individual goal of getting this qualification that is important on the working market or for the further education, gets connected with the collective goal of actually
Mm-hmm.
being active in a society together with others.
So even if a person comes just to obtain a certain degree or finish compulsory education, he or she also finds opportunities to become a more active citizen in their community. Okay,
Yes.
and that's great. Actually, I wanted also to highlight such a peculiarity, which seems to me a peculiarity, very good one, that both municipal and popular education are quite inclusive. I'd like to clarify what measures on the local level and the governmental level probably were taken to ensure this opportunity of social inclusion of learners with disabilities and some other disadvantaged groups.
Well, in the folkbildning sector, it was, I would say that it was quite soon. One of the advantages of the folkbildning sector is that it is always adapting to the needs in the population, because it is formed by and around civil society organization. The civil society organization is by themselves formed because citizens have seen a need to work with a certain issue or to make the society more inclusive in a certain way for a certain group. So because of this, it is always adapting and changing towards different groups that has been disadvantaged in the society somehow. And therefore, you could see that in the folk high schools and the study associations, there were work that were including, for example, citizens with different kind of disabilities long before you had the political rights, long before the laws said that you should have the right for further education, for example. The work was done within the folkbildning sector. And today you see that that is one specific group that is targeted, both in the, targeted specifically in the folkbildning sector. A quite large number of the participants have some kind of disability. We know this because the folk high school can get a certain grant if you work towards this group for specific extra costs that it could be. And we therefore also know that the largest group are people with neuropsychiatric diagnoses. And this is because the school system has, and maybe even in a worsening ways, have possibility adapting to the needs of many people with neuropsychiatric diagnoses. And at the same time, the working market in many OECD countries have been less and less inclusive. So the society has been less inclusive, and therefore the education has been less inclusive, and then the folkbildning has taken this societal and has become this possibility for this group. At the same time, we have also strengthening the rights, the formal rights in the law for people to get the education you need, no matter which kind of disability that you have. So you have certain possibilities within convux, for example.
Okay, you answered the question which I was going to ask you about the laws, because it is really important to have this relevant law basis to conduct certain practical things, even when we talk about the inclusiveness of education. So aren't there any troubles when accepting laws on the governmental level? Is it like a smooth story for Sweden?
I believe that we've had, for quite some time at least, a positive development on laws giving rights to groups that and individuals that used to be having disadvantages in the system. But at the same time, laws are one thing, and the preconditions that are created by other circumstances that in its effect creates the culture is another thing. And here you can see that take, for example, the working market, that Sweden had an economic crisis in the 1990s. Before that crisis, Swedish unemployment rates was most often 1 to maybe in disadvantaged groups 4%.
Mm-hmm.
So that meant that a very large share of the population got a work, even if you had some disadvantages that made it impossible for you to produce on 100% each day on the working market. It also meant that to be able to get the workforce that you needed, a lot of companies took social responsibility. They took in workers even if they knew that this person has some kind of disability that makes it necessary for us to adjust the demands on the person. Today and for a long time, Sweden has had a very high unemployment rate, especially for young people and especially for people that did not get degrees from upper secondary high school. And that means that even if the laws have been better, sharpened, given more rights, the actual possibilities has been worsening. The exclusion has grown. So that makes it more important for the educational sector to follow the laws and to make sure that you give the possibilities that we should give to all people. But at the same time, we of course also need to make changes within the working market. If you have an unemployment rate among a specific group on 30%, it won't be possible to educate that unemployment away. What you need to do is to make sure that education is not only changing the individual's possibilities, but also changing how the society functions.
Okay, yeah, it's quite a complex issue, and I'd like to talk about higher vocational education. What was interesting for me is that it is really practice-oriented, and it is followed by training at the workplaces. How do education providers cooperate with employers in such a way that there is a strong emphasis on workplace training for the learners?
To get the contract from the state to provide education within higher vocational education, you need to have that cooperation with the employers on the working market already. So you need to guarantee that there will be the possibility to learn on the workplace for the students that get into higher vet. And quite often it is actually the employers themselves that try to make a cooperation with an educational provider and apply for a contract on organizing higher vet. And the reason for that is that the employer in a certain branch sees that they have a lack of labor force, so they need to make sure that more people are educated in the sector. And because you have this willingness from both the employer side and the education provider to arrange the education in such a way, there is good possibilities that you get a high quality. And at the same time, the state authority in this case that gives these contracts, they are always scrutinizing not only the quality within the specific education, but also the needs of the working market. So you can get a contract to educate for a certain work in 2 years or maybe 3 years. And then the authority says, well, now in this region, we actually have enough people competing for the works in this specific branch. So you won't get a new contract. We need to organize other higher vet trainings. And that because we then know that the working market exists, it also makes quite good possibilities for giving on-work training in a high quality.
Okay, it seems like it's also beneficial for the employers And from the materials which I read, I found out that there is quite a high rate of like people who find job right after finishing schools, after training in about 1 year. I don't remember, like
it's something about 83% or something like that at the moment. It used to be even higher. What's happened is that we have both we have an economical situation with a higher unemployment rate all over, but it's also that we are going from fast change of the labor market to rapid change of the labor market. So before we could plan for and make a good evaluation on how the working market would look like in 1 year, in 2 years, now the possibilities, mostly because of AI, can change in months. So 2 years ago, if I had a participant that came to me on the folkhögskola, we're getting ready on the folkhögskola, but needed a more specific education to compete for work, I would happily suggest for the person to educate themselves to become a computer programmer. We had a big need for computer programmers, and a lot of people in higher vet has been educating themselves in computer programming or being in education for computer programming. But today that need has fallen drastically because of AI. That basic programming is now so much done by AI. So these companies doesn't hire in the same as before. But of course, specialized programming using AI, the need for that has grown rapidly instead.
Yeah, and also some technologies with managing AI, actually implementing AI technologies into operations of companies. Everything changed drastically during the last years, even a couple of years.
And meeting with colleagues to you from Ukraine in the horrible situation of the fight that ordinary Ukrainians are putting in their lives every day in solidarity, that we stand in solidarity with. We also know that you are making a lot of experiences on how to rapidly make changes within the society to make sure that even in wartime, people's possibilities to build a future and to have a possibility to make dreams of the future should withstand. So I know that we also have a lot to learn from you to make sure that our systems get to be more resilient in a time of more crisis, even if we all pray for and work for and give all solidarity for you winning the war and making sure that this kind of wars doesn't end up affecting any other European countries.
Thank you.
Fight for all of us.
Thank you for your support, and I hope it will be, like you said, that the war will finish with the Ukrainian victory. And I also guess that resilience is something that all people in all the world should nurture and cultivate, because time is very unstable, and nowadays, we can see that even one report by some politician can influence on the markets, whatever. So we should be ready to adapt to such rapid changes. Okay, returning back to adult education, and some other questions I'd like to ask is promoting of adult learning. I wonder whether you have a need to promote adult learning activities, or people are so aware of adult learning that you have no need to organize any extra promotional activities or events to engage students. And what are the most typical ways probably to engage students into adult learning?
Well, that's a very good question, because it depends on how we define the need for promotion. If you look at the folkhögskolas, for example, there are nearly always more people wanting to take the courses than we can offer places on the courses, and people that are wanting to make the change in the life that a folk high school could be part of. And the higher vet also have, because of this system with being built together with the providers on the work, with the providers and the employers, also have a high degree of applicants for most courses, because people know that in this pathway I can get a job, and it is built to promote that. So in one sense, if you just look at on how many applicants we have for the courses we can provide with the funding that we have today, there is no need for promotion. In another sense, we know that there's a lot of people in the Swedish society that feels that they do not have gotten a fair chance, that they don't know which way they should take to handle a situation of long-term unemployment, or handle a situation where they work in bad circumstances on the working market, short-term contracts, bad working conditions, and so on. And many of them don't know that they would actually have the possibility to change their life circumstances through adult education. So there's a need for reaching out and involving more people in adult education. But to be able to do that, we need to have more possibilities, and that comes down to more funding, actually. We could quite easily double the courses on the folk high schools, not from one year to another, but in a plan over several years, and still have the same quality and probably the same outcome if we look at which interest that we see already today. And if we did that, then we could do promotion as well to reach groups that are today turning their back on adult education because they don't think that they are people that could succeed in adult education.
Okay. Yes. So it also depends, as I understood. Like sometimes people don't know what is going to happen after they are involved in some adult learning. If we speak about study circles, something where people can socialize and just change themselves a bit by interacting with other people and communicating and doing something what they haven't done before.
Yeah, and if we look at that, those kind of education possibilities that have no formal requirement or formal qualifications, but are important for people to handle their everyday lives, they are often very, very cheap for the state or whoever who funds it. But they are an investment in a better functioning society, and also an investment that are economically sound for society. We know, for example, today that one of the growing and fast-growing economical challenges for a society as Sweden is our aging population. But elderly people, they doesn't need to be an economical cost for a society, but they become an economical cost for a society when there is a human cost. When elderly people lives in loneliness, with bad health situation, which bad possibilities to interact with other and to interact within the society. So courses directed to seniors in different ways, they are very cheap to organize, but they will most probably be a good saving for the state in health costs and other costs, on top of the human growing and human better conditions that they create.
Yeah, this connection is not that clear when you just say preventing diseases or bad condition of our poor mental health among the elderly by organizing courses for them. Yeah, it sounds like something not so related, but actually there are many aspects of life which can be affected by adult learning and just attending those learning environments.
We know that loneliness is one of the most dangerous parts of getting older, and one reason for a worsening health situation, which becomes to human disasters, of course, but also economically difficult for the society to bear.
Yeah, for sure. What I saw from the presentations you sent, so many people in different municipalities take place in folkbyldnінг, and also there were many people in rural areas. Like, if I'm not mistaken, the majority were people in rural areas. So how does adult education in Sweden respond to this need of people in certain geographical conditions?
Because of folkbyldnінг being built up by and around civil society organization, that there hasn't been any need for regulating that. Sometimes, of course, the state have made a special investment of a special need that you see. For example, when many refugees came to Sweden in 2014, 2015, there were a special investment in the folkbyldnінг for making sure that you could have voluntary Swedish lessons within the folkbyldnінg setting. So you can make extra investments. But in the base level, on the fundament of the work, we have a funding with very little regulations from the state, because the state knows that while funding folkbyldnінg, you get a very flexible system that wants to reach out to the people in the biggest needs, and are also, or has at least for many years been very heavily based in the rural areas because of historical reasons, which made sure that in many parts of Sweden that has been undergoing urbanization as other countries, while other possibilities in the rural areas has disappeared or moved to the cities, and that is companies and work possibilities and also authorities, the folkbyldnінг has stayed, because the folkbyldnінg has been organized by the people that are still living there. So that has been one of the few investments that the state could have done that has actually gone out in the capillaries of the society to the small villages.
Okay, and speaking about the funding, it seems that the Swedish model of funding adult education is quite successful, yeah? And more than 70% of adult education services are covered by the state. Actually, in many countries, adult education and its condition depends a lot on budgeting. What recommendations could you offer to representatives of different countries facing such difficulties as poor financing of adult education and a lack of institutional support?
Well, my recommendation to the legislators and power holders in this case is that democracy is not a project, and making sure that people have educational possibilities also as adults is not something that could be done for 3 years and then we could prioritize something others. This need to be long-term funded. And the Swedish success in this manner, and it is a success, Sweden has very, very good evaluation in, for example, PIAC that measures how adults learns as adult, and a measure that we have adult citizens that actually learn more while being adults. So it's not only a question of a good basic educational system, but actually a question of good adult education institutions. We have such good evaluations, and the reason for that, I would say, is that what we have been speaking on is basically not project funded. It is funded on a long-term basis. For the folkbyldnīng sector, which very few regulations, very big freedom for the folkbyldnīng providers to arrange the kind of education that they can see is most needed. And for the municipality adult education, based on the rights for the individual to get basic education. So part folkbildning, permanent funding, or at least we have been thinking that it's permanent funding with small regulation, and municipality funding based on the rights for the individual to get certain courses.
Yeah, that's a very good remark. And I think that building sustainability of funding is one of the keys to this success. Okay, I guess it's time to wrap it up. If you have any final thoughts, remarks, or recommendations, you're welcome to share.
Oh, I'm full of thoughts on the system. So, but I'm very happy that we have this kind of meeting. I'm also very, very happy to have had the possibility to be active on the level of European adult education, not only because it's important with the programs such as Erasmus, and when Ukraine gets to be members of the European Union, I sure hope that adult education is still part of the Erasmus Plus program, and that adult educators in Ukraine and adult educators in other parts of Europe can meet through this funding. But not only for that, but mostly because within the European level, with EU members and non-EU members, you get the possibility to meet other individuals, educators, learners, sometimes both educator and learner at the same time, that are constantly working to make sure that people has the possibility to grow as adults in different settings. And that has been so very inspiring to meet. And even though I'm very much an advocate for the Swedish system, and I think that it's a part of, as it's been called, a Nordic secret of growing democracy from beneath in this way. I think that I have been less and less exoticizing the Swedish system through meeting all these great educators in Ukraine and other places that are also in their settings doing a remarkable job and learning and get so many experiences that I've been learning from.
Thank you so much for your time and this talk. It's worth mentioning that this video was created by the Ukrainian Adult Education Association with support of DVV International in Ukraine and with the financial support of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.